It was only a few months back that I was talking about how much I loved Cosmodread, and how it ticked all of my Spelunky and VR boxes. It was well designed, it had plenty of unlockables, and it gave me a ton of reasons to keep playing long after I rolled credits. It had practically everything I wanted, so I definitely didn't think I'd be back so soon, having such a similar, even more positive conversation about yet another roguelite on PSVR2. But Ancient Dungeon VR has been on my mind constantly since the day it released. It's a game that launched tragically on the same day as RE4's VR mode, although you might be surprised which of the two games I kept finding myself coming back to. You're either going to love or hate Ancient Dungeon VR right away. I know a lot of you might get turned off by the somewhat Minecraft-esque voxel art style, but I love it. As a huge fan of 3D game heroes, and more recently the trend of HD 2D games like Octopath Traveler on Switch, I think it's a style that hasn't been explored enough. And here, it works exceptionally well. Enemies look like Legend of Zelda and Dragon Quest 8-bit character models brought to life. Vines hang down in your face, torches and candles illuminate the hallways, and practically every crate, table, and chair is destructible. And even better, the whole game runs at a native 120 FPS and in super high resolution, making everything feel really fluid. But the impressive visuals, which probably don't translate well to the social screen, pale in comparison to the immersion. Tapping your pixelated sword against a pixelated wall will cause stone voxels to crumble to the ground, and chopping vines and grass will cut them at the point of impact with some of the most subtle but most realistic haptics I've ever felt in the Sense controllers. It all just feels so right. Oh, and check out the music. It's some sort of hybrid of Batman the Animated Series and Harry Potter. But I really shouldn't have started this review talking about graphics and music, because that's not what Ancient Dungeon's about. In fact, the only thing that matters here is gameplay. You'll traverse 5 levels of a dungeon, killing enemies, exploring, collecting coins, and just trying to survive. On your right hand you have a sword, and on your left a throwable, retractable dagger. Everything's tracked 1-to-1, which means, yeah, your weapons are weightless, but you're likely going to need that reaction speed that it gives you. As enemies swarm you, you can either hit them or use the side of your sword to push them away and give yourself some much needed room. The throwing feels insanely precise from both a power and accuracy standpoint, so killing enemies from a distance is your best bet whenever possible. Eventually, you do unlock a crossbow, which has its own advantages and disadvantages, and although I do think it makes the game easier, I still go back and use the sword pretty frequently. Unlike another recent game that we don't need to mention. Having 2 inventory slots on your wrists actually makes sense here, because Ancient Dungeon isn't about crafting, it's about risk-reward and making decisions, like whether you should just run off and go fight the boss, or keep exploring and save up money to buy items at the store. Every dungeon's randomly generated, and you'll find different perks and buffs on each run, with new enemies and even boss variations appearing on occasion. It makes every run feel a little different, with some being far easier than others, and some just being kind of odd. It's not quite Binding of Isaac levels of bonkers, but it is up there somewhere. Just for an example, check out this weird thing that grew out of my wrist one time and started fighting with me. Or the time that I was down to half a heart. And the perk I found said it would double my heart containers, but drop my HP down to, amazingly, half a heart. So for most of that run, I was one hit away from death, but with the potential to be completely OP if I could just find some health somewhere. And the fact that all the passive perks you find stack is just ridiculous, meaning you end up being insanely powerful at the end of an awesome run. And after every successful and every failed run, I immediately want to dive right back in and try again. Each run takes about an hour depending on how far you get. And so far, I've died about 10 times and beaten the final boss about 5 times. But finishing the game is just the beginning, with each completed run allowing you to upgrade your weapons further, purchasing permanent upgrades, and eventually you even unlock a modifier list to up the difficulty in a variety of ways. All of this adds a ton of replayability, and constantly dangles another carrot for you to grind for. There's only 5 stages here, each with its own boss. And while that initially feels a little light as far as content goes, I think any longer would have just been too much for a game that's meant to be played and replayed. And while I don't want to spoil anything, things do get more interesting the more times you complete the game, with the new Game Plus option unlocking, which, yes, is actually different than the standard typical roguelike gameplay loop, which amplifies the risk-reward exponentially. I didn't even realize this was a thing for roughly the first 10 hours, so just when I thought my addiction might be dying out, it was suddenly reignited, and now I'm more hooked than I was even before. I'm struggling to come up with any real complaints here, but if I'm getting super picky, then I did experience some very infrequent frame rate drops when just a ton of enemies were on the screen, and for a game with such awesome haptics, I do wish that reloading the crossbow felt as good as everything else. But really, that's kind of it. Ancient Dungeon VR is practically a perfect game. It looks, sounds, and plays great, the haptics are awesome, the gameplay loop so far hasn't gotten old. At this point I've spent about 15 hours with it, and based on the available upgrades, it looks like spending another 50 hours here isn't out of the question. There's even a 3-player co-op mode planned for sometime later this year. And so while I absolutely love Synapse, Ghost Signal, and Cosmodread, all great roguelites on PSVR2, this one is by far my favorite. And f*** it, I'll just say it, this is one of my favorite games on the platform.